Okay viewers, this is part 2 from The Cold Truth, the Myth of Radical Islam with Dr. Wissam Shah Kawai. And sorry doctor if I haven't pronounced that right, I'm not doing it on purpose. From One Path Network, a very popular Muslim network. Much better. You get some good stuff on here if you want to understand more. But let's go into part 2, see what the doctor's got to say from here.
Minister, or as a deputy prime minister, or as a prime minister in John Howard's case, come out with that sort of negative rhetoric, you're actually unleashing hostilities at minority groups. And when we see then a 740% or 800% increase in Islamophobia, political rhetoric plays a role. Political rhetoric also plays a role in terms of identity and social identity. The other thing, for example, Bronwyn Bishop, same, she came out and she said, there's no place for the face veil in our society. Or you have Pauline Hanson, for example, who walks into Parliament 2017, 2025, and she sits for some 15 minutes. You're effectively pitting one against the other. And the media has had no let up on this, right? So the media, you're talking about Sky News, you're talking about the Daily Telegraph, all the populist tabloids, they've absolutely amplified this narrative. And those narratives that exist, you look at the hostile narratives that we see, the free, noble West, right? The free, noble West versus the backward, repressive, oppressive religion. Mm-hmm. This framing by the media is actually quite serious, and we hear it all the time. And that plays a...
I think the problem on looking at it from the other side, trying to understand, and I can see the doctor's argument, absolutely, 100%. But looking at it from the other side is, why aren't the Muslim clerics and everybody else getting out there on the TV? They have every opportunity to, and saying, no, we don't agree with these terrorism acts. One or two. No, we need the Muslim community to come out and wave to us and say, look, we are not involved in these terrorism acts. And then the next thing, you got 2 doctors in Bankstown Hospital getting lumbered for saying they kill. They're their own worst enemies in a way. It's no point being silent on these major issues, right? When they've got access to the media. When these things happen, no, we don't agree, we don't want anything to do with it. And sit there and say, well, everybody else has got something to say about it. No. You've got to come out and condemn it yourselves as well.
Massive role in identity. It plays a massive role in terms of how a community responds to that rhetoric. We've seen more neo-Nazi groups pop up than any other time, and there is a direct correlation.
Yeah, but let me just say, the neo-Nazi people aren't running around gunning people down and all this other stuff. No. They're a problem all of their own, but they're not machine gunning people down and this, that and all the other.
The political narrative. So when we say that this is politically advantageous...
And just let me stop there. Anthony Albanese, Tony Burke and the other pro-Hamas politicians, they seem to blame the neo-Nazis way more than what they ever do the Islamists. The Islamists have to take responsibility for the terrorist attacks done in the name of Allah Akbar. They have to. They've got no choice. It just is the way it is. But if the Muslim clerics and the Muslim representatives of these people aren't coming out and saying we condemn the actions of so and so and so and so, then what are people supposed to believe?
It is politically advantageous, but not empirically true. So we need to get to the bottom of what are the drivers? What actually drives terrorism? What actually drives violent extremists? This is where the academic question is so important, because it's not just talking about how one sort of perceives things, but rather getting to the heart of the matter.
So there's a sociological problem with terrorism, and there is a theological problem with terrorism and crime, be it Christian, be it Muslim, be it whatever. These things have different percentages and different motives at different times, but it's going to waver in and out, or it's going to combine the two. But again, as I said, if you're running out firing bombs and this kind of thing, saying Allah Akbar, then what can the Muslims say, really? Like they're saying on the show here on One Path, we just sit there and cover our eyes every time there's a terrorism attack, hoping that it's not one of us.
Saying that I think it's very important for us to understand the reason why we're having this conversation is to remove the blame from Islam, because it's unfortunate that we're constantly seeing Islam and Muslims bear the brunt of responsibility when it comes to these horrific actions, and there is no diminishing from the level of horror these atrocities have. Like, we are in no way, shape or form trying to diminish from the horror of terrorism and the violence it unleashes on society. But what we're trying to do is remove the blame from Islam, which has been falsely attributed, and unpack the true root causes of terrorism. What is to blame? Given that...
Well, as I just said, it's diverse and it's multi-duplicitous. There's all different reasons, but to try and exclude Islam from it altogether is denialism. That makes you look like a denialist. I'm not saying that's what One Path and the Doctor are trying to do. They're probably trying to get to the bottom of it themselves. They're probably trying to figure out, okay, we've figured out Islam in a peaceful way. We know the jihad is scriptures and instructions are there, but we ain't going to do it. What causes one of our brothers or sisters to actually do it? What gets them to that place? What is causing them to do it if they're Muslim? And to sit there and say it's either a pathological problem or something else, theology has a way of getting into pathology, into the person's pathology, and producing evil, whether it's in the name of Islam or not. I mean, the Christian minister's not going to run off with the worship leader and say it's in the name of God. Right? The Christian minister's not going to murder his wife and run off with the secretary and say it's in the name of Christianity. He's still going to say, I'm a Christian. He's still going to justify his evil, but he's not going to stand there and say the name of the Lord Jesus Christ while he's doing it. But in saying that, there are people that do. There is a way in which over-devotion causes murderous pathology, evil pathology, and it shows you clearly in the New Testament scriptures. If you go over devotion and you think you're running around and your prayers or your 5 prayers a day and all this, that and the other's making God happy or stopping him from being sad, you're on the path, whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to believe it or not, that's wide. Because anything can happen. Temptation, sin, which leads to, and it can even lead to death. Over devotion is the cause of it. And that's why possibly, the extent of the terrorism amongst people singing out Allah Akbar, whether they're Muslim or not, I don't know why they'd be saying that while they're doing it, usually has to do with some kind of overcommitment or lack of self-esteem towards their religion and trying to gain that back. But as the doctor said, it might have nothing at all to do with it at all, but they're still going to scream out Allah Akbar. So, yeah, it's a good conversation.
It's not Islam. So what causes?
I think it's perfectly appropriate to start with a quote, and I have here a quote with me today from Olivia Roy. And Olivia Roy, in a book wrote in 2017 on jihad, he mentioned in his book, he said, what radicalizes individuals, this is such an important quote because I think it encapsulates what academics have been saying for decades, but what radicalizes individuals is not religious doctrine, but political events wars and the perception of injustice.
Okay, so that's evasion. That's just one side of it. That's evading the religious input into radicalisation. But we'll give the doctor the respect he deserves.
Especially foreign interventions in Muslim countries. So Olivia Roy made that point and spoke about foreign policy. Martha Crenshaw, all the way back to 1981, said that it's perceived injustice, political exclusion, blocked participation. So foreign policy definitely has been considered by academics as a driver. There's no question in that. And that's very strong and significant in the literature.
Yeah, but doctor, you're only going back to 1981 and you're quoting people that probably none of the Muslims or any of the Christians have ever heard of. Let's go back to AD 650 to 700, 800, 900, right up to the Crusades, and figure out what Muhammad wanted and what they did. Because the Christian Crusades just didn't happen for no reason. They were to stop Islam taking over with its Sharia law and all the destruction that it was causing wherever it went. Now, were there political things going on? I'm sure there was, but that wasn't the problem. When Jesus was crucified, you had Pontius Pilate and Herod tossing him around from between each other. That was the political side of it, but who wanted him crucified? The Jews, the theological group. Pilate did everything he could to get him off, even bringing out a murderer, thinking they'd choose the murderer over Christ, who was innocent. But what did the religious people do? They said, crucify him, release to us Barabbas, let Christ's blood be on us, and it has ever since, the curse of it. But it was not the political people, it was the religious people.
Other scholars have held alienation, social exclusion, social alienation, humiliation. There are people who have conflict with family. There are people who have individual facets. So you've got your political, you've got your social, and you have your individual facets. Sometimes it can be a combination, but all of them together, Mark Sageman said, you have group identity and social.
So hang on, why is he refusing to bring in theological? Why? Why is he evading the theological side of this? What's he trying to do?
Where they did speak about the identity and social identity, friendship and solidarity.
Yes.
But what they didn't focus on was theology. Right? What they didn't focus on was ideology, but what they did focus on was to say, well, you have your political facets.
Yeah.
Well, that's my question. Why didn't they focus on the Islamic theology and ideology? This guy's starting to look a little bit unsure, the interviewer at this point, a little bit uncomfortable.
This is your geopolitics. You have your politicians, your negative media framing that impacts identity. You have family structures, you have individual facets, social facets. All of these things are causes. To get to the heart of the question, I think this is very important for government and policymakers and lawmakers, is that we need to start addressing the contexts that give rise to terrorism, to violent extremism. If we just
Okay, so we're looking at the context of the writings, the context of the person's life, the context of their application of their religion, the context of their grievances with whatever thing they got a problem with. Are there micro-incremental pieces or larger pieces of all these things individually and collectively that cause people to run out screaming Allah Akbar, murdering themselves and others? It cannot be void of theology. It just can't.
Pigeonhole the problem, then we never look at the root causes. And that's what the academic question seeks to answer.
That's true.
You've got hybrid threat environments. So for example, hybrid threat environments talk about that it may be that a person, for example, says, foreign policy and geopolitics and is impacted by that, but there's also something happening locally, like a perceived injustice. There might be a double standard being applied, and that it impacts that person on a very individualized level. So to simply say this is a problem that Islam fits the bill, then we're very far from reality, because it doesn't. And if it did, right, and if faith were the cause, and if it were the root cause, then that basically implicates every single Muslim, Christian and Jew. To say that then every single faith and every single doctrine, then we have billions and billions of people on the planet who are violent extremists. And it's simply not the
No. what it means is, and what it absolutely means is, there are flaws in the way we perceive our religion and our theology, be it Jewish, Christian or Muslim, or I've said it from the start of the video, that contribute, if not exclusively, but collectively, to a murder event or detrimental event, be it on whatever level.
Case. Doctor, forgive me, I am going to double down on this because, as you've just mentioned, theology was considered irrelevant to these researchers after they've...
Not a sufficient cause.
Not a sufficient cause.
That explains
so there
the
wasn't
context.
enough evidence to attribute any blame towards the theology. So I'm going to double down for the sake of our viewers and our audience. Why
He's
is
a good little interviewer, this gentleman.
that we do see some, especially Muslim terrorists, unfortunately, quote theology, quote scripture when they are going about their horrific actions?
Terrorism. Oh, mate, what a question. What a question. I really got to take my hat off to the host. He's very fair. He's not just letting it go.
It's always going to happen, and it's something that I need to refer you back to, right? Faith is attached to explain the violence that has already been pushed by other facets and already been driven by other facets. And those other facets, as we mentioned, the political, the social, and what we've just discussed, the individual. But faith is never at the forefront. Faith is not a root cause or a driver, but something that is attached afterwards to explain the violence, but not that.
Well, I'm sorry, but that's a failed answer. It's not a complete answer, Doctor. It's not a complete answer, because faith can be genuine, and faith can have hope in the things that you're hoping for with your religion. But the theology behind the religion, the requirements and little things that, like you get the jihadist preachers come through, or, the little things in the religion that cause you to try harder to make God happy or stop him from being sad, they're going to cause evil. To what level, I don't know. I'm sure the Muslim people are not always faithful, or they steal, or they lie. I'm sure all that's going on. It's up to them to decide what causes it. But theology, Muslim, Judaism, Christianity, can covertly, without you even knowing it, despite your other grievances, escalate your manifestation towards whatever it is that's driving you.
Drove that person to be there to begin with. What
So
drove that person to
as
be
an
there?
excuse, would you say? It's being used as an
It's
excuse?
utilized as it's justificatory. It's utilized as a justification, but not as a root cause. And I think therein lies the conflation.
Okay, so maybe we need to get to the issue of sin, right? Which is what religions try is supposed to resolve.
Not a driver or cause of terrorism. Let me just say that. When something is a cause, when something is a driver, it means that faith initiated it.
Yep.
Faith started it. That's never the case. And the literature shows that's not the case.
What literature is he talking about? Because the literature of Muhammad clearly states that we're doing a takeover. We're taking over the town one way or another, whether you like it or not. We're going to eventually, he wanted Sharia law right through it. Now, what? Oh no. Okay, let's put it this way. Say a Muslim man goes next door and has sex with his Muslim friend's wife, and the Muslim bloke comes home and shoots him in the name of Allah Akbar. Was it the religion that caused the problem, or was it the religion that offered the solution? Because in ancient times, the solution for this kind of trouble, right, which wasn't allowed by religious standards, was execution. So the person's got a problem with the other person sleeping with his wife. That's the personal part of the problem. That's the personal grievance. But by nature of the religion, be it Judaistic back then or Islamic, Arabian, Muslim, whatever, you were to be executed, you and the woman. The perpetrator and the woman were to be executed. So you've got a sociological civil crime, act, intrusion, that's mediated out and fixed by a religious execution. That's it. Today, that doesn't fit. That can't fit in modern society. It just will not fit. It's a crime to do that. And this is the problem. Can you see what I mean? You cannot, and it's dangerous to remove theology too far away if these people are involved in these religions from the cause of the problem. I'll put it this way, and I'll be fair to the host and the doctor. When I study crimes, new crimes on the internet and what's going on, I always ask, my first question I ask, because I know, is, are they Christian? Are they Christian? And I'll be honest with you, 7 out of 10 times the problem people are Christian underneath. Right? I know. Oh yeah, I know. I never separate the theology from the crime until I see who's who in the problem. And if people are committing, you've got to take it off to the host. He's brilliant. He's not frightened. I mean, because there'd be some Muslim people that would be very uncomfortable with the way he's challenging the doctor. It is foolish, it is dangerous, it is ignorant to try to separate theology from the crime at whatever level it is, as part of, or if not exclusively, the driver behind, covertly, whether anybody's aware of it or not, as an inclusive part of the matrix that's caused the person to become sinful. Let's just say sinful, so that it's not extreme. And that's it.
And that's an important point to start at. That's an important point to begin.
Yeah.
If faith enters the space way after a person has already reached the point of violence, this is not what we're talking about. How do you nip it in the bud at the beginning? So then what are the root causes? And what the scholars talk about in terms of root causes are the political, the social, and the individual. These are the facets that we need to address. Hybrid threat environments are real. So you look at geopolitics, but you also look at, in combination with what might be happening at home, perceived local injustice. It may be that
100% what's happening in the home, because there's a lot of trouble behind the scenes in these homes, and the next minute the wife's sleeping with the bloke up the road, or the best friend, or this, that and the other, and then there's a triangulation, then there's a murder. A lot of the stuff that causes these people to sin lustfully is their religion. You cannot exclude that from this problem. It's dangerous, it's careless.
a person perceives that law enforcement has applied the law in one facet but not applied it in another. It may be that a person perceives something in a very twisted way, but that's an individual facet. That's not a faith facet, right? And so, faith is being blamed to say, well, faith drove you to be there. Faith was responsible there. You read a verse and you all of a sudden, you are a terrorist. Well, that's just simply not the case. And the literature does not hold that view.
So why is it that we see faith or scripture verses being quoted by these actors?
Oh, wow. This guy is, wow. You got to give this guy an Academy Award. He needs another YouTube trophy, this bloke, on his wall. What's his name? Excuse me, viewers. I don't know who he is, but he'd be treading on some toes, I can tell you that. Gosh.
Well, a person has reached a point of violence due to the driving factors of violence, and that could be the political, the social, individual, whatever the case may be, right?
Or theological. Doctor, where you're going wrong You just have to put part of the ingredients as possibly theological. I'm not sure why the doctor won't do that. Very sad.
Whatever is mentioned in academia, that person has already reached the point of violence. Of course, across history, we see people, they hijack faith and they hijack...
You know what? The interviewer at this point is deflated. I have to say it. I'm not saying he's not being respectful, but he's deflated. I think he expected a little bit more than this.
Religion, and they hijack all sorts of causes and drivers and whatnot to be able to justify the violence and to justify their actions. So faith, yes, of course, faith can be hijacked. It can be hijacked by anybody, but faith was not the driving vehicle that brought that person to that point. There were drivers, but it wasn't faith. Faith was hijacked and utilized.
Exploited.
Well, exploited, effectively. And that's been done.
That's not true. He doesn't know how sin works, unfortunately, the doctor. And one of the main powers of religious sin is over-devotion to God. Read Romans 7 and understand Romans 7. The rules and ordinances and demands of your religion empower, right, for righteousness, empower your sinful nature. So the doctor's a little bit blindsided about sin here.
Across history, that's been done for all sorts of causes, for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of agendas that people have exploited, and all faiths across the board. And it's not unique to Islam, and people have utilized
100%.
whatever they want to utilize to justify what they're trying to do. But the point that we
100%.
need to answer today is what got them there, what drove them there, because it certainly wasn't faith, and that's what the literature is saying. It wasn't faith. What was it? And that's what we need to uncover, and what the academics have been telling us.
And you've done a tremendous job of literally unpacking what the academics have said when it comes to the causes and the driving forces behind terrorism. But on that point,
one of the obvious differences between Islam and Christianity is that Christianity gives you the answer, if you want to find it, to how religious-driven sin works across the board. It's universal.
what is the profile of a terrorist in that case?
Well, for years, academics tried to neatly put together a profile of a terrorist, and this happened for decades. So they tried to map out a neat path, effectively grievance, ideology, and violence. We see that reflected in the pyramid model, in the staircase model, in the conveyor belt model. I mean, you can sort of gather what I'm saying, the staircase model, one step before the other, almost like in a linear fashion, the pyramid model, the conveyor belt model, all of these had sort of the same understanding. Effectively, you go from grievances, then to ideology, and then to violence. It was sort of for them in a very neat type of straight line. The recent ABC model we find in 2025 actually held a different view, and scholars mentioned different points about it. And what they actually said was that holding extreme views does not automatically lead to violence. That a cognitive radical is not a precursor or proxy for violence. I mean, John Horgan held that view to say you can be a cognitive radical. In other words, you can have radical cognitions, but non-violence is the norm. In other words, the vast majority will never go on to do anything and never go on to commit any violence. I mean, this is what the academics are saying. I mean, look at Pauline Hanson in question. I mean, she's somebody that espouses extreme views. But do we say that she's a violent extremist? And it's until we see violence and until that violence is put out, that actually becomes the problem, and what is actually being said in the ABC model. Another facet that said that violence can actually occur without deep ideological commitment and engagement. So that's going forward. We have this discussion in academia which actually says, well, the vast majority of people who hold extreme beliefs never actually commit violence, and that non-involvement is the norm. Let me say that again.
Well, that depends on the foundational goals of the beliefs that you follow, because Islam's ultimate goal is supremacy, right? It's supremacy. It's Islamic supremacy under God's law. That's it. There's no in between, right? So the doctor's a little bit, I think the doctor's a little bit blindsided.
Non-involvement in violence is the norm. So people can certainly harbor extreme views. And let me just give you an example about extreme views. Being anti-establishment. I mean, if you're anti-establishment, someone might call you an extremist. But if I'm anti-establishment, that doesn't mean I'm a violent extremist. I, according to you, might have extreme views because I'm anti-establishment. I might be anti-law enforcement. I might be anti-this and anti-that. In your view, you might say I'm an extremist, but that doesn't make me a violent extremist. In fact, violence, not committing that violence is the norm, right? And this is what the literature and the academics have been saying for a very, very long time. It's unfortunate that we keep hearing the same rhetoric over and over. But let me give you a study, a significant study. This is a really important study. In 2024, I conducted a systematic review. A systematic review is a meta-analysis. In other words, we looked at every single preventative and countering violent extremism program across the planet, on the planet. And we were looking to see what works, what doesn't work, what people and societies have done, what governments have done. And what we found was actually quite interesting. We looked at the programs that failed. And the programs that failed, what was missing? Why did they fail? And what we found, the certain elements for why they failed is because they didn't address those root causes that we spoke about earlier.
The driving forces.
The driving forces. They didn't address them. They weren't there. And because they weren't there, we were able to draw a very coherent and reasonable assumption based on the meta-analysis. Well, these things were missing from all these failed programs. So they didn't address the root causes in those programs. Hence the assumption that they failed based on their absence. And so there was one case, and the data is so rich in terms of what it shows us. There's some cases that individuals have engaged in violence even before adopting ideological narratives. So even before they've come to adopt that type of thinking, that radical thinking, they've engaged in violence before that. So we need to look beyond just what we're hearing and beyond what is populist and beyond what is popular.
Okay, I'm going to throw a spanner in the works, but what would you say are the components of a successful countering violent extremism / radicalization program? What would be the components if we truly want to address the issue head on and remove it from our communities and our country? What would be the components?
Well, let me rephrase this. And so you're saying what were part of the things that...
What could work?
What
What should we be doing?
What could work? What should work? What did work? Let me give you let me rephrase. So we ran a study. The study that we ran, it's a published journal, and maybe I can put the meta-analysis and the systematic review in the references, and if people want to read that, then by all means they should. But what we found was that if you engage somebody, this is causal, by the way, it wasn't inferred. If you engage somebody in an honest conversation, let's say about geopolitics or foreign policy, we found that people, whilst their cynicism of government increased, that it led to more engagement. So what we found is, if you and I sit down and have a conversation about geopolitics, so you could be law enforcement, or you could be somebody who represents government, but we had an honest conversation about foreign politics and what it means and what it's done and the impacts and how that it's affected family, destroyed infrastructure, destroyed entire neighborhoods and so on. If we have an honest dialogue about that, it actually increased engagement, even though it increased my cynicism. So in other words, let's not talk about things that are cursory. Let's address what actually is a real problem and what matters. And if we can do that, then you're getting to the heart of the problem, even though I might be more cynical, but we're having an honest dialogue. And what we found was it enhanced engagement, even though it increased cynicism. So that's a really good place to start in terms of government and law enforcement when they're talking about policies and they're looking at their foreign policy and geopolitics. You need to be honest and open what the impacts are, what it causes, how it affects society, how it affects people. You need to be honest about your actions, and responsibility and accountability matters. And so that's just an example. We don't have the luxury to go into every facet, but you can go into family matters, right? So, but I'll give you one example. What we found was that family engagement. So let's say, for example, somebody was in one of those programs. If family was involved in that program, so you attach that person to family, it actually had greater success than if family wasn't involved. So what that meant is, look at what we've just said, this engagement from family as a driving facet, which leaves one impressionable or vulnerable to the narratives of violent extremists, right? So,
well, Muhammad killed a woman's family and she poisoned him. I wonder if Muhammad's family came to the meeting for that.
You can see what rendered a program successful when you addressed some of those facets that were missing up front.
As opposed to ostracizing
Correct.
someone. Well, that's very important. I feel like it comes back to the heart of the matter. We're addressing this academically so we can address the issue more intricately, more comprehensively, more effectively. I think that's the crux of why we're having this conversation. Sheikh, Doctor, I believe there's also a problem when it comes to our definition of terrorism, to begin with, at the very forefront. When we speak about terrorism, especially in this country, ideology and religion, unfortunately, are embedded within the very definition itself. So how do we begin in addressing this?
Well, look, okay, before the doctor jumps into that, the reason is because they're screaming out Allah Akbar and they're killing Jews. That's theological. Let's see what the doctor says.
unfortunate that John Howard included ideology and faith and religion into the terrorism definition. That's very problematic because it has real consequences. It allows police to assume and infer intent from what is read, from what is written, and from what is viewed. If you just look at some of the new laws, possession of violent extremist material. Say, for example, you were sent a video, you're part of a WhatsApp group, somebody sent you a video. You watched that video not knowing what it was, and it automatically downloaded into your photos and library. If somebody then dobs you in and says, hey, look, I believe Kamal has a video on his phone and he's in possession of violent extremist material, and I think he's a little bit extreme, right? I think he's a little bit extreme.
I'm sure that's already happened.
And he's in possession of violent extremist material, right? Police are forced then to investigate. We saw this following one of the events in Sydney where a priest was attacked. The day after, 7 kids were charged with possession of violent extremist material. And they were not on the radar, right? They were not on the radar. But somebody said that these kids are 1, 2, 3, 4. And 3 of them, 4 of them, I think from memory, are out on bail. And the judge criticized the case. And he criticized the case because what is readily available on people's phones is highly problematic, because then you start to police intent. And we see this in the UK a lot, that the courts are being asked to effectively police things that people may read, which are lawful books and legal books. They're not outlawed, but you're inferring intent from it. The problem with all of that is that you begin to take normal practices that may be happening in the life of a Muslim and then infer intent from that. Let me just give you an example. So I was involved in one case, a real case, where I was providing a report for somebody who'd been charged with a terrorist-related offence. In the brief that was put forward by JCTT, the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team, part New South Wales, part AFP, one of the things in his brief was raising the index finger. And you imagine that Muslims do that on a daily basis. And what they were effectively saying, that this person is part of ISIS because he raises the index finger. That was one of the facets, that it's just a known symbol to raising the index finger. And you can start to see now, when you infer intent, you begin to encroach upon even those religious, normal, everyday practices that Muslims do. So you start to locate the problems only within the Muslim community. You never look at the problem context. You never look at the environment. It's only located within the Muslim communities. It's a really significant problem that we have. And for a very, very long time, the structure and the narrative has been such.
So now that we've understood,
there is. I just want to add a little. Sorry, Kamal, to cut you. I just want to add a little bit more to that. There's no agreed upon definition of terrorism either. So for John Howard and other prime ministers to enforce that, I think that was also a problem, because there's no agreed upon definition.
I think you'd have a definition for terrorism if somebody ran up and shot him in the leg or dropped a can of spaghetti deliberately on his toe. He'd start coming up with the definition for terrorism.
This whole space that we're talking about, this whole field that we're talking about today, for Muslims, it's not in the abstract. And let me say what I mean by not in the abstract. The Australian Federal Police groomed a 13-year-old autistic boy with an IQ of 70. When we talk about inferring intent from what a person reads, writes, and views, so the parents of this 13-year-old autistic boy called the police. It was referred, rather than provide him with the assistance that he was required and shut down all of the avenues for this person engaging in what he was engaging in. They groomed him and they allowed him to further. They encouraged him. This is not in the abstract for Muslims. This is the Australian Federal Police grooming a 13-year-old autistic boy. These are real. These are real happenings.
I heard that story.
And this is the problem when you begin policing people on the basis of religion and ideology. This is the problem that we have. It's not in the abstract. It's actually quite real. So treating ordinary, everyday practices has real ramifications for the Muslim community.
I guess we can't understate the horrific and severe nature of that case of a 13-year-old autistic boy being groomed towards conducting an act of terrorism, or grooming him towards becoming a terrorist or a radical person. I feel like that's horrific, and it really speaks to the crux of whether or not we're sincere in actually addressing this issue to rid it from our communities, or are we manufacturing the problem, which is horrific to even think about. Doctor, what are the consequences of this misdiagnosis of terrorism in our community?
Another of the consequences of the misdiagnosis is effectively you target the wrong communities. And when we look at disproportionate surveillance, raids and suspicion, which have been incessant specifically targeting the Muslim community, we go back to between 2005 and 2010. This is talking about specifically singling out, targeting a community.
Just let me say, in 2005, Israel gave Gaza to the Palestinians. This is a bit off track. They gave Gaza to the Palestinians in 2005. It wasn't declared a state, but they had the land all to themselves. The Israelis dug up the graves and all the rest of it and got out of there. Some of them had to be physically removed. But we'll come back to this in the next take. Bye for now.